0.25. And, well, let's get into it, yeah? I just want to preface this by stating Affliction's strengths and weaknesses, and some of these have changed, some of these have remained fairly the same. Two of these have remained pretty much the same. We have strong single target on fights with adds via Wrath of Consumption. We have incredibly strong multi-dotting and cleave. And we have incredible mobility due to a large amount of our damage coming from our instant cast dots. Those being, let's see, Agony, Corruption, and Siphon Life. And you can even consider Phantom Singularity or Soul Harvest as a mobility increase, because both of those are instant casts. Now, where Affliction falls weak, we don't really have much in the way of burst, unless you count things that are specifically oriented towards either single target or area of effect burst. We have decent-ish burst, however, if we just spam Unstable Affliction, but this requires a bit of ramp-up time to get the full damage going. And that part is kind of terrible, because the waiting for it. Whereas Destruction, on the exact opposite end of the spectrum, has very good fingertip burst. Affliction in general is heavily balanced around adds, and Affliction can be very mediocre on fights without adds or out multiple bosses. And it's got a relatively low skill cap, and having high RNG means the spec's very easy to pick up and master, but once you do master it, it's quite a bit of gambling going on with it. Alright, so let's get into the legendaries, because it's also a hot topic change. Two new legendaries that were added, let's pull this up here, were the Master Harvester. And this is, like, if you're running with a Soul Conduit build, let's just throw a quick one, for example. Like, a build like this, for example, the chest piece and the belt are the best simming legendaries. The only problem is the chest piece is actually a lot more RNG. You're really having to factor in those soul shards you're spending proccing Soul Harvest, so in many cases with Master Harvester you're still better off running Soul Harvest to double the duration. And the second legendary that was added was the Soul of the Netherlord, which is actually a very strong ring. It's not your best legendary, but depending on what your raid group needs, it's very powerful, because if people die during an execute phase, it not only makes the boss last longer, making the ring more powerful, because Death's Embrace is a very powerful ramping execute, and that's what makes this ring very strong for Affliction if you can use it properly. Like in execute phases, Affliction walks and just do crazy, crazy good damage. Let's pull up the artifact here. Give me a second. Put this microphone down for a sec. Okay. Now, the artifact has received a change, namely to Wrath of Consumption. And this was a necessary change, and I know some people were freaking out about it, but Wrath of Consumption was has received a 50% nerf. So instead of stacking up, giving you 2% increased damage per stack, it's only a 1% increase. And with Reap, it's like, I think, a 10% increase to damage, whereas before it was a 20% increase. So it's still powerful. Wrath of Consumption is still arguably like where most of our damage comes from on ad fights, but it's not as powerful as it used to be, which it's not bad. It was a needed nerf. Another thing that was changed was Phantom Singularity and Siphon Life have swapped places. Siphon Life has also received a huge damage buff. I believe its damage was increased by something like 30%, and its healing was nerfed to 60%, because even then that's still really, I mean, even then 60% healing from all the damage is still really good. Phantom Singularity is actually the weakest talent in terms of raw damage on this row. Like, UA cleaving, if you do it right, is actually more beneficial than PS. Phantom Singularity, its cooldown was dropped from 60 seconds to 40 seconds, so it's actually gave us a good burst window. Problem is, most fights with ads have things around a 35-second window, so you're having to wait 5 seconds for Phantom Singularity, and the only thing that has 40-second boss timers is Gul'dan with the eyes. So it's about the only fight you'll be using PS on unless it's heavy burst AoE, in which case you're probably better off playing Demonology. Phantom Singularity's damage is increased by a measly 5%. That's really not much to write home about at all. And the healing done from the damage was reduced to 20%. So Phantom Singularity still, in my opinion, loses out to Soul Harvest, because if you manage the buff properly, it's better than than Phantom Singularity. Contagion was nerfed by 3%. It's still the best talent on single target and 2 target if managed properly, but for anything really realistically for most players, once you get to 2 target, you're better off going with AC. If it's pure like heavy AoE paddleboard, it's going to be empowered life tap, but for the most part AC is still better than ELT because ELT is cancer to play with. Malefic Grasp got nerfed pretty hard, but it's arguably a little more mobile than it used to be, but it's still very, very bad for mobility. It's the best pure single target talent we have, but Writhe and Agony is really close. There's really not much of a difference overall. Haunt received several changes, namely the cooldown was reduced from 30 seconds to 25 seconds, so that's good. Its damage was reduced from 805% spell power as shadow damage to 500% spell power as shadow damage. Its damage amplifier was reduced from 30%, which was a lot, one reason that made Haunt actually useful on ad fights, to 15%, which it has its place on maybe farm shenanigans or leveling, and its duration was reduced from 15 seconds to 10 seconds. Not much to write home about, but that does make it have a lot more downtime, and that also makes it not see a lot of play. Writhe and Agony has had its stacks reduced from 20 to 15. Its damage is still relatively the same, it just doesn't need as long ramp-up time. And Soul Harvest has received multiple changes. Namely, its base duration being reduced from 15 seconds to 12 seconds, and the duration added per Agony is increased from 2 to 4 seconds, up to a maximum of 36 seconds. All Affliction damage spells were increased by 14%, and the following spells have received specific nerfs in addition to the about 14% buff. Soul Flame was nerfed by 20%. Really, technically, it's about a 10. It's about a 9% difference from 7.2, I think. Sea of Corruption was also nerfed by 20% again, about a 9% net difference from 7.2. Agony was nerfed by 5%, about I think it's 8.3 a difference from 7.2. I'll have to do some more looking into that specifically, but Corruption was also nerfed by 5%, and it's the same difference as Agony, so Corruption still does a lot of damage, and Agony still does a lot of damage. Alright, so let's get into the talents, and what's good and what you should be taking, and what builds I would really suggest. For the level 15 row, this tier was actually heavily nerfed in this patch, as it's the power level on that row was absolutely insane, and Affliction actually got a hefty flat damage increase to all the spells to compensate. Haunt got nerfed around the time of the patch release, and generally won't be a good choice for raiding really much of anything. In short, Malefic Grasp for single target, Writhe and Agony for cleave. Basically the same as 7.2, really. For tier 30, Contagion's generally the best choice because it provides a large increase to your single target and cleave. Absolute Corruption is still very strong on multiple target fights in this tier where you can abuse infinite duration corruptions. Demonic Inquisition and Desolate Host in particular stand out. Empowered Life Tap is only useful for sustained AoE, which you'd be using with Sow the Seeds. Tier 45, Demonic Circle is always going to be token for raiding. Mortal Coil has some uses in Mythic Plus, as it really doesn't have the same DR diminishing return as stuns. Howl of Terror is almost only usable to proc Sifus if you have the legendary, as it's off the level cooldown. In raids, always take Circle and Mythic Plus. Take Mortal Coil unless you need the Circle or don't care to respec. For tier 60, this tier is actually incredibly strong and fairly balanced in terms of what you want to do. Mythic Plus, you typically always want Sow the Seeds, and anywhere where there's sustained AoE. In raids, you'll usually use Phantom Singularity. Soul Harvest is a great choice if you need Burst or Ad Spawns lineup wall to give you Wrath of Consumption synergy. Basically, like Tychontrius or Croesus are great examples of that. So really, this tier, for the most part, you are taking Phantom Singularity. For tier 75, this greatly depends on your fight. For the most part, I can't think of a situation where you would not use Burning Rush. But in general, you're always safe to use Burning Rush, as Warlocks are incredibly tanky baseline. If you don't feel you need the mobility, Demon Skin is good on fights with constant damage, and Dark Pact is good on fights with large periodic hits of damage, like Ursoc. Or really, Cenarius is a good example where all three work, because there's the parts where you could just pop a Dark Pack and like soak one of the spikes, except on Mythic, but you could do it. Burning Rush is just good to avoid the Sisters debuff, and Demon Skin is just good for the constant damage spike that goes out because of Brambles. If you're in there, which you really shouldn't be. For tier 90, you will always be running with the Grimoire of Supremacy in 725 and swapping between Infernal with 3+ targets or when you need the stun, and the Doom Guard also used when you need the Interrupt and pure single target. For tier 100, this is a very, very interesting tier, and here's why. Death's Embrace is roughly the same DPS as the other talents for any combination. However, it's pretty back-ended, meaning you want to run it on fights, on fights with Execute. Well, on fights where Execute is important on, like Desolate Host, Eye of Ashara, and Mythic Plus. Many people feel the rotation plays better with Malefic Grasp, but they take Soul Conduit over Siphon Life. Those sims do show that they're incredibly close, within like 0.5%. For Ride, you generally want to run Siphon Life unless you won't have the global cooldowns to maintain Siphon Life, like for Mythic Cards Attack. There's several recommended talent builds. This is sort of a recommended questing build. Tier 45 and 75 are optional, but this is just a good questing build for the new Blitz. Or even like low-end heroic dungeons, low-level Mythic Pluses, like using Mythic 2s, or questing. It's a good build for that. A general-purpose single-target build. This may look familiar to some of you Warlocks. This one right here. Malefic Grasp, Soul Conduit build. General-purpose multi-target. Rather than Agony, Phantom Singularity, Supremacy, and Siphon Life. Burning Rush. And there's the Heavy Dot Mythic Plus build. And this is a fun one because a lot of people use this in general. I'm personally one of them. And this build's very strong for dungeons and affixes that have lots of a single target to 3 target. The focus is on maintaining your agony and corruption on every target and UAs on as many as targets as possible. And it works best with the legendary belt and the bracers, which if you already have the bracers and the belt, you're set for this build because it's really good. Heavy AoE Mythic Plus build. This is just pretty much common knowledge with this build. You can even justify taking ELT with this build. And this build is pretty much most of you know this, or at least I hope you do, that it's very strong for dungeons and affixes with lots of single target and AoE, especially teaming leagues. Okay. So every spec has some mechanics that go into it, yeah? And for Affliction, all of our mechanics mostly revolve around dots, well, obviously. I'm trying to think here. Okay. Obviously, Agony is our soul shard generator, and it's our primary and really only source of soul shards unless you have the tier 24 2-piece, I believe, which allows corruption to generate soul shards. But what happens is every time a dot ticks, it gains a stack, and the damage increases for every stack it has. Soul shard generation is no longer based on a flat % chance to proc on a tick, nor is it the ramping percentage chance to proc on a tick that was present in alpha. Instead, every agony tick adds a 0 to 32 invisible soul bits. When you hit 100 soul bits, you gain a shard. The amount of shard bits gained per tick is reduced by the number of agonies you have ticking currently. This means at some point it stops being worth it to apply agony to targets. It's usually around, I think, like 4 or 5 agonies. For Seed of Corruption, there's our area of effect Soul Shard Spender. It can be used baseline to spread corruption to multiple targets, and talented to deal 3 times more damage. It's really good. Unstable Affliction is our single target Soul Shard Spender. It costs 1 Soul Shard for an extremely high damage dot. There's a few things to keep in mind with the Unstable Affliction. It does not gain bonus ticks from haste, and it will always have 4 total ticks. It usually always has an 8-second duration, but this is reduced by haste. So if you're playing with like haste for like a Destruction Demonology Rock, you have a pretty short UA, but it still ticks those 4 times, but really quickly. Because of the total number of ticks is static, haste effectively just reduces the time it takes your UA to deal full damage. It's in part designed this way because haste also increases your shard generation, and if it also added more UA ticks, it would scale your spender twice. Each cast of UA creates a separate dot up on the boss up to 5 separate instances. So that's really good, and you can actually cheese this like in multiple targets. Like used to, you would be able to, like, if the target was on die, you could like dump 5 UAs and get 5 shards back. They fixed that pretty quickly, to where you would have to find 5 different targets, put a UA up on all 5 of those targets, and then when they die, you'll get the 5 shards back. You can technically apply 6 UAs before the first applied expires. It's not possible to waste UA damage by applying more than 5 in a row as the dot pandemics. If a target dies before UA expires, it refunds a shard, like I was saying before. However, only 1 soul shard is refunded per target. Multiple UAs on 1 target will only refund 1 soul shard. It's kind of shitty, but yeah. Drain Soul is one of our basic fillers, like Corruption. It heals for a lot, deals okay-ish damage, and generates a soul shard if the target dies under its effect. With Writhe and Agony, you can actually afford to snipe targets with Drain Soul, and it's really good to do. Pandemic is a term you'll see a lot when researching the Warlock, and you'll hear a lot of us talking about it. Basically, it's a mechanic that allows you to refresh your dots and add the full duration as long as the dot has less than 30% of its time remaining. And this means you won't waste any dot time as long as you refresh your dots under 30%. So basically, Pandemic is incredibly important to keep up with, and which is one reason why in multiple target cleave, 3 to 4 targets especially, Absolute Corruption is a lifesaver with Pandemic timers, because you try playing with Contagion on that many targets, it's just a nightmare. You can't keep up with that many targets realistically, and trying to measure everything, and then cleave Unstable Affliction if you have enough soul shards to dump. It's crazy. It just gets crazy and out of hand. That's why most of the time Soul Conduit's really good. For pets, our pet selection is pretty much Summon Fell Hunter. That is if you're not running Grimoire Supremacy, which you really should be doing. And he gets bonus damage based on our dots, which is pretty cool, but it's not much to write home about. He also gives you an interrupt. If you're running Grimoire Supremacy, which again you should be, you're going to be wanting to run Doomguard and single target, giving you an interrupt and solid damage, especially in Execute. Or Inferno and 3+ targets, giving you a solid area bonus AoE and a AoE stun on a 1-minute cooldown with Command Demon. Alright, for the rotation, we're gonna be going into like 2 builds for this, or at least 2 of the most used builds. Okay. The rotation for Affliction has changed very drastically in 7.2.5, simply put, because more and more talents are viable now, and they focus on our 3 abilities in Tier 15 specifically: Haunt, Writhe in Agony, and Malefic Grasp. Any cooldowns like Fam Singularity, Siphon Life, not Siphon Life, but Soul Harvest, etc., or any cooldown stuff, unless delaying them a short period of time lines up with the adds in a burst phase, it's pretty much true with a lot of things. Like, there's sometimes you actually do want to delay Soul Harvest or PS, but I'll get into that in a second. The Malefic Grasp playstyle, is, assuming most of you are aware, focuses on dumping Unstable Afflictions and then draining until the UAs expire to maximize their damage. The rotation is very cyclical, so a list of abilities doesn't really do it justice. First, you need to understand what a UA cycle really is. And a UA cycle, putting it simply, is because your maintenance dots, Agony, Corruption, and Siphon Life, have a temporary duration, you have to interrupt your drained soul at some point to refresh them. You want to dump your UAs when you know you won't need to refresh your dots during the UA duration. So the general concept is, wait for your maintenance dots to be in Pandemic range, less than 30%. Refresh all your dots. Unstable Affliction up to 3 times, or as many as required to get below 4 shards. What that means is that generally you only want to dump at most 3 UAs per cycle, but you should prioritize not capping shards over this rule. You don't want to be you don't want to ever be at or above 4 shards, because then you can get an Agony and 2-piece proc at the same time and waste a shard, and that's never fun. Reap Souls, generally at 2 stacks or anything that's like higher than 2 stacks, and Drain Soul and just drain until the cows come home. Well, until the UA's expired, but yeah. Now that you sort of have an idea of what a drain cycle at least should look like, there's some basic ground rules for how to prioritize this. Life tap should only be used in downtime between UA cycles, or preferably during movement. Reap Souls should be used anytime you're dumping UAs. Delay use if there's an upcoming mechanic you need extra damage for, like an ad coming out or whatever. Maintenance dots are always more important than a UA cycle. Interrupt your drain soul if any of your 3 dots are about to fall off. This is important to keep in mind because sometimes you end up having to dump 4 to 5 UAs at a time with shard RNG. Preventing shard capping is always more important than a UA cycle. Never hit 5 shards. If you hit 4 shards, you should interrupt your current cycle and dump the UA. If you're playing MG, you probably don't care about your cleave DPS, but in the case that you do, it's worth to interrupt a UA cycle to maintain your dots up to 2 targets. It also helps you better shard RNG and more damage through priority targets, that type of deal. As I was saying earlier, Malefic Grasp is more mobile than it was in 7.2, but it's still very immobile compared to many of the other specs. Playing around with fight timers that require you to move is crucial to mastering Malefic Grasp, and sometimes you may just want to dump all of your UAs and get less value from Malefic Grasp so you don't cap while running about, which has happened to me before, and it's not very good. It's very, very sad. Similar to the previous statement, it can be worthwhile to dump all your shards during temporary damage buffs like Wrath of Consumption and Soul Harvest, or if you simply need to burst and add, like on Botanist with the flowers. Writhe and Agony is a fun one. Let's look at that real quick. The Writhe rotation mainly focuses on maintaining your maintenance dots, and trying to maximize the uptime on Contagion, if you're talented into it, of course. If you're also taking Absolute Corruption on a fight, prepare for a snooze fest. It does get pretty boring, but I actually like playing AC because I'm lazy. The general rotation is Reap Soul should be used anytime there's at least one UA on the target, or if you have a temporary damage buff like Soul Harvest. You want to maintain Agony on all targets, at least up to 5. Never cap on shards. If you're at 4 shards, you should be casting a UA or Seed of Corruption immediately. Maintain Siphon Life on all targets, that is if you're running it, which you should be. Unless, of course, you want to try to double dip the Soul Conduit RNG, which actually does technically give you more DPS. Maintain Corruption on all targets. Sometimes it's worth it to use Seed of Corruption to apply corruptions just to save level cooldowns. Think of the Hearts of Tam Murlocs. Light tap if you're near looming, which is like less than 10%, or if you're moving. And lastly, cast Drain Soul. There is something missing with this rotation. The use of Unstable Affliction outside of preventing shard capping, and it's a bit too complicated to explain it mathematically, or like why you shouldn't do it like words, but it also mainly depends on your talents, and there's a couple guidelines on this. For Contagion, UA should be used to maintain your Contagion debuff as high an uptime as possible. You should mainly just try to only use Unstable Affliction if you don't have UA on the target, and maintain it on as many targets as possible, or if you risk capping shards. That being said, you should also look to dump any shards you have during the large temporary damage buffs, such as Boss Mechanics or Soul Harvest, or especially Bloodlust. Even though it doesn't affect your UA ticks, it's a huge damage buff because of the large amount of haste. With Absolute Corruption or Empowered Life Tap, you should try to pool your shards for temporary damage buffs. Trinket Procs, Concordance of the Legion Fall, Soul Harvest, and Boss Mechanics are all great examples. If you go long periods without any of the above, or don't have access to any of the above, you should just dump UAs, or dump any and all UAs you have during Reap Souls, because Reap Souls is still a damage buff. Since most of your damage is coming from your dots, Writhe is incredibly mobile and forgiving if you misposition yourself, which is a very good plus about the spec. Drain Soul sniping, which is casting a Drain Soul on a target that is about to die to gain a shard, is exceptionally strong with Writhe due to the 3 global cooldowns you have from not having to maintain Malefic Grasp cycles on target. And Haunt, this rotation is almost identical to Writhe and Agony with one noticeable exception. You should shard dump UAs during the Haunt debuff if the UA will get at least 2 ticks off, which is 50% of its duration before Haunt expires. This varies drastically based on your haste, so pretty much this spec you gotta kind of play it by ear. Some of the most important things to note about mastering Haunt is figuring out how to work around ad timers on fights, and if you know an ad will be coming around within the next 20 seconds or so that you can kill in the duration of a Haunt, delay your Haunt so you can get a reset. Haunt also amplifies Soul Flame, so if you're doing a fight like Scorpion, you can actually use it to push more Soul Flame damage into the boss. Seed of Corruption is pretty much just the same for every talent, but if you have Sow the Seeds talented, if you seed over UA on 3 or more targets. If you don't have Sow the Seeds talented, use seed over UA on 5 or more targets. Seed isn't very useful without Sow, sadly. There are some exceptions to these hard breakpoints, particularly in the case of Contagion. Oftentimes with this talent, you're better off just cycling UAs on multiple targets to take the 15% damage buff, which also stacks with the bracers if you're using them, which also give you a stacking 4% damage buff per every target afflicted with unstable affliction. So it's always good to use. Just to, kind of look at what you got. But Haunt, there's actually a burst build that I actually made in the Warlock Discord, and it's actually this build right here. It's more of a PvP build, but it's actually a very, very heavy burst build for Affliction, even in PvE. I believe the Akalon managed to get this thing to pull around 1.5 billion DPS in the opener burst, but after that, you cannot sustain damage with Haunt, and that's the only sad part. Contagion is still slightly better than ELT because it still can give you more Haunt damage windows, but regardless. I think here. Oh, yeah, I wanted to talk about stats. Stats have actually changed a lot since 7.2, and right now they're actually pretty fluid. What I mean by that is Affliction's an extremely multifaceted spec, sort of like what Demonology used to be. And your stats change in value based on the type of content you're running and the talents you pick. It's also very important to understand why and when a stat is good for Affliction. Haste is a stat that makes everything but cooldowns faster. It's the best source of throughput for Seed of Corruption spamming and makes your agonies ramp up far faster when target swapping regularly. It's also good for increasing your single target burst by making your unstable afflictions deal their damage faster. This is why Haste is an ideal stat for fights with lots of target swapping or AoE in Mythic Plus, and basically Mythic Plus in general. Mastery makes your dots hit like a fucking freight train. Just plain and simple. Fights where an unusually large portion of your DPS is Agony, Corruption, Siphon Life, UA, Mastery is going to reign King Supreme. And think fights like Demonic Inquisition and Desolate Host where over 90% of your DPS can be from dots. Fights like that, Mastery reigns supreme. Crit gives you big numbers more often. It's the primary method of scaling soul flame damage. It's actually the main method, but that's aside from the point. Affliction has a crit steroid in the form of an artifact trait, Perdition. With 3 relics, you can get up to 46% critical strike damage during Reap Souls, which is insane. Versatility is sort of the red-headed stepchild of World of Warcraft. If your spec likes versatility, it usually means something is very, very wrong with its design. So, the general footnotes are for single target and AoE with the seeds, Haste, Cleave, Mastery. Lots of soul flame damage like Scorpion, crit. For information, for any kind of stuff like this, it's always better to sim your character. Like, Affliction stats are very fluid, like general purpose stat weights, Haste and Mastery are equal. And what that means is, it's good to have both of them relatively balanced. Crit's not far behind it, so don't neglect crit. Versatility narrowly beats out Intellect, but what this means is they are both equally worthless. Like, Intellect doesn't have as large of an effect on your stats because you're going to be getting so much of it from things like the weapon and all of your armor. Like, it's almost not worth it to prioritize Intellect and gems because you already have so much of it. And I guess we could talk about gearing. Okay. For the most part, if ideally with Affliction in your gearing, you want Haste and Mastery on pretty much everything. or haste mastery or mastery crit on just about on really all your pieces. And our new tier 20 is the Diabolic Raiment, and the artwork is based off of our old tier 6, the Malefic Raiment, which includes the ever famous Warlock wings. The 2-piece gives your corruption a 0.65 RPPN chance per tick for a soul shard. This, however, does not scale with the number of targets because it's RPPN, sadly. 4-piece gives your soul shard spenders a 25% chance to proc a 15% haste buff for 8 seconds. Actually really good. Our old tier 19 is the Legacy of Akir. The 2-piece gives you 10% more unstable affliction damage, and the 4-piece gives your agony a 10% higher chance to generate a soul shard. Both very strong pieces, but the tier 20's 4-piece and 2-piece ultimately make it very much stronger than the tier 19. However, in some cases, it's still worth keeping your tier 19 2-piece, but it mostly depends on the item level of those pieces and your available legendaries. Our tier 22 piece was heavily nerfed after release, but it's still more shards generated than our old tier 19 4-piece. The tier 24 piece is incredibly powerful and should be acquired as soon as possible. The old tier 22 piece is worth a decent amount, usually enough to use worse legendaries, Pride As Belt Ring over better ones like the Helm. This again heavily depends on the item level of your tier 19 gear, so I recommend simming what you have. Legendaries. This is a very important feature in Legion, and the fact that everyone gets legendaries. After completing your class hall campaign, you can equip up to 2 at any given time. These legendaries range in power and effect from having effects on our utilities like Demonic Gateway to directly increasing our damage from agony. Below it, good lord, there's the list that we have, and I can pretty much remember it off the top of my head. Cross-spec legendaries are Pillars of the Dark Portal, Morgannon's Foresight, Salumbra, the Knight's Dichotomy, which this actually isn't that bad because of the 3 sockets. You can throw in 3 haste gems, which is really good. Master Harvester is a cross-spec legendary, but it's also very strong for DPS. Pride As Magnum Opus. Where's that damn thing? Okay, there he is. It's one of the strongest shield necks in the game, but regardless. Soul of the Netherlord, which every spec can use because it allows him to take different talents. KJ's Burning Wish, which is a very mediocre stat stick. And Sindori Spy, it is a general legendary, but you have to be in Demonology loot spec to get the item. Affliction specific legendaries, or ones that, affect the Affliction spec specifically, are the Hood of Eternal Disdain, the Power Cord of Latendrus, Sacrilash's Dark Strike, Reap and Sow, and Stretton's Sleepless Shackles. Sacrilash's Dark Strike is terrible. If you get it, I feel very sorry for you. 2 best legendaries for Affliction, really with Writhe and Agony builds, Hood of Eternal Disdain is by far the best, and that's followed by generally Reap and Sow or the chest piece. Usually the hood and the chest are the top 2 for Writhe builds. Overall, Affliction legendaries are very well balanced. So whichever one you use will depend heavily on your raid composition and the individual fight in general. In general, though, the Helm, Belt, and Chest are of similar value and are your best choices for raw DPS. Although I still don't recommend using the chest if it's possible because it's still extremely RNG, but it's still also incredibly strong. The belt also pulls ahead on cleave, as more of your UAs can be cast on targets without UAs. Basically, it's double dipping into Soul Conduit. Soul of the Netherlord is slightly lower overall DPS than the legendaries above that I just listed before. but it gives you incredibly powerful execute, and there are multiple fights that this is great on, like Desolate Host is a 35% burn, but it's also always a good legendary if you think your guild will have people dying, making an execute last longer. Sacrilegious Darkstrike is actually best in slot on a few fights where you may have many targets out for a long period of time, in conjunction with Absolute Corruption, namely Demonic Inquisition and Desolate Host. The flow is also incredibly useful on multiple targets, and the challenge, quest for Affliction. Prydaz Severix Magnum Opus is only a few percent, like maybe I think like 1 to 2% depending on your gear behind better legendaries, and it provides a large increase in survivability and is always a solid choice for progression, particularly on fights that are very healing intrinsic. Stretton's Sleepless Shackles has some very niche uses for cleave fights where you want to run Contagion. However, it's not recommended for beginners because it's actually very hard to juggle Agony and Corruption on multiple targets and also cycle Unstable Afflictions. The only notable cases of this that I can think of are on like Mythic Harjatan, where you can keep up 3+ UAs for a large part of the fight, and Fallen Avatar if you need more split damage on the ad. As of 7.25, all relics are relatively equal in power, the only exception being Drain to a Husk, which increases Drain Soul damage by 2%. That's notably the weakest. Because of this, the higher eye level relic is usually better. A Drain to the Husk relic usually needs to be like 15 to 20 eye levels higher to even be worth using. An Unstable Affliction crit chance also doesn't scale very well with addition to the with additional targets compared to dot relics. It still scales better than Drain to a Husk. For the most part, you should use raid bots to compare potential relic upgrades. For your gems, enchants, and consumables, for the neck, you generally want to enchant Mark of the Trained Soldier. For rings and gems, this depends on your gear. Haste and Mastery are very close in tier 20 gear, and it's safe to enchant and gem haste if you also want to play Affliction, if you also want to play Destruction or Demonology. Your potions, always the Pot of Prolonged Power. And that's about all I can think of at the moment. Yeah, that's all I can think of at the moment. Unless you want me to like link macros later on, but I don't think that's really necessary. Either way, I'll be here for a little bit longer. If you have any questions, I'll get to y'all in chat in a second. So, yeah, just let me know, and I'll also be linking the Discord that I founded in description if y'all have any questions you want to ask there. Well, that's one where I can actually show you guys what I'm talking about, I guess. Okay. Well, while this is going on, I guess I'll show you what exactly I mean by, like, Phantom Singularity is recommended in most cases. for damage. However, it's mostly, it's like, it does so little damage over 14 seconds, it's really not worth considering. So, what I would personally recommend taking is I personally recommend Soul Harvest in most cases. And, I don't know, I guess the reason I say that is because once you maximize it on, like, even 2 targets, it's better damage than Phantom Singularity on AoE. Now, Siphon Life is the best on Cleave, and I usually always pair it with Absolute Corruption. Like, this is a build I typically run. I like Contagion and all, but it's also pretty hectic to play with. Or rather, can be pretty hectic. It's up to people to decide. It's not really my place to judge. Okay. So, one thing you want to keep in mind with each build of Affliction is that they all play relatively differently. Malefic Grasp is pretty much the same, although this is about the same build you wanted to run. You will be running this build for pure single target. So, Goroth is about the build you want to run this on. So let's sort of give you a go. Okay, that was awkward, but whatever. Now, I'm not by any means the best Affliction Warlock in the world. I do a little bit of theory crafting, but I consider myself fairly lousy at this spec. Basically, Malefic Grasp with this playstyle is really, really simple. Because for the most part, it's a 2-dot spec, and you just drain and drain and drain. Writhe and Agony is a little bit different, and one of the specs that you can consider running with it is one kind of like this. That is, if you want to be using Soul Harvest with it, it's up to you. Contagion actually stacks with Soul Harvest relatively well, so I do consider using it as an alternative. But it's up to you ultimately. Haunt plays similarly to Absolute Corruption. Or not Absolute Corruption, but Writhe and Agony. And what that really gets down to is Writhe and Agony is a dot build. Haunt is an amplifier, but it's a 25-second cooldown, so it's not going to be used as frequently as Malefic Grasp, because you're not going to be filling with it, or rather spamming it, I should say. And just for the sake of this, I'm just going to put like an Absolute Corruption Writhe build. And I'm just going to go through a basic cleave rotation. And as a general rule of thumb with Soul Harvest, you only want to pop it, or you should be only popping it when it's at max, when your Agony's at max stats, and is not going to fall off anytime soon. Like, Siphon Life just fell off, but it's also an incredibly short duration. It's one reason I actually don't like using it. And if you, any of you all are curious, I will be providing my Patreon link into the description for the channel, as well as my PayPal if y'all are ever curious in donating. You don't have to, but any donations will be greatly appreciated because it will help me get like better equipment and stuff. Like, Affliction, as a side note, historically plays better on multiple targets. And that's basically the good gist of it. For the most part, like, I should have been testing 3, but that's also, you know, it gets kind of hectic. Even with a, like, for me it's a little hectic because Siphon Life has such a short duration for me that it falls off pretty quick. Which is one reason I do like using Soul Conduit. Because, I mean, sure, it's a little bit less damage and cleave, but it also leads to more unstable afflictions. On the whole, it's a fun spec. The Affliction's a fun spec. It can also be relatively easy. Anyway, this has been Kenneth Lee signing off. I'll be bringing more guides potentially for Destruction and Demonology sometime soon. Alright, peace.